The lights in the private conference room of San Francisco's Meridian Tower shimmered against the tall windows, catching the gold cufflinks on Adrian Santoro's tailored suit as he stood before the assembled men. These were not shareholders or investors in any conventional sense. They were associates, partners in ventures that existed in the spaces between legal and necessary, men whose loyalty was bought with respect and maintained through power. Adrian had done this countless times before, commanded rooms with nothing more than his presence, his voice a low rumble that made grown men lean forward to catch every word. But tonight something was fundamentally wrong. His voice, usually steady and deliberate, faltered mid-sentence. A hand instinctively reached for his chest, fingers pressing against the silk shirt as if trying to hold something inside that was trying to break free. His brow furrowed with confusion and pain. His stance, always so controlled and measured, shifted unsteadily. And then, without another word, without the ceremony his reputation demanded, Adrian Santoro collapsed. The room erupted, not with gasps from a curious public, but with the organized chaos of men trained to respond to crisis. Chairs scraped back, phones appeared, orders were given, and voices that carried authority born from years of handling situations that couldn't involve conventional help. But this was different. This couldn't be fixed with money or influence or careful words in the right ears. Within minutes, Adrian was being carried out by his own men, Rocco and Enzo flanking the stretcher like guards protecting their king, even as he lay unconscious. The sirens that eventually came wailed through the San Francisco night, but by then the conference room had been cleared, the meeting erased as if it had never happened. The hospital room Adrian woke up in felt like a prison. Sterile white walls, the oppressive hum of machines monitoring every beat of his failing heart, fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and lifeless. He blinked slowly, his mind fighting through the fog of medication and shock, struggling to piece together how he had arrived at this moment. A doctor entered, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that had delivered too much bad news to offer false comfort. She carried a clipboard like a shield and spoke with the careful precision of someone who knew the weight of every word. "Mr. Santoro," she began, her voice clinical but not unkind. "The tests have confirmed our initial findings. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, advanced and aggressive." Adrian stared at her, his face unreadable, the mask of control he'd worn for decades refusing to slip even now. "Treatment options?" His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but it still carried that quality of command that made people answer. The doctor's expression didn't change. "At this stage, treatment would be palliative at best. We're looking at approximately 6 months, perhaps less depending on progression." 6 months. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable. Adrian didn't speak. He simply stared at the ceiling as if it held answers that his body had already rejected. The doctor continued with details about pain management and hospice care, but her voice faded into background noise. When she finally left, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking, Adrian remained motionless. 6 months, half a year, 180 days to reconcile a lifetime of choices, of power accumulated and enemies made, of bridges burned and relationships sacrificed. He had built an empire in the shadows of legitimate business, created a network that stretched from the docks of San Francisco to the penthouses of Manhattan. He had survived challenges that would have destroyed lesser men, had negotiated with people who viewed violence as just another business tool, had made decisions that kept him awake some nights and made him who he was on all the others. But none of that mattered now. He had no wife. Relationships in his world were complicated at best, dangerous at worst, and he had never allowed anyone close enough to matter. He had no children, no legacy beyond the business itself, and that would be carved up and distributed the moment he was gone. His parents had died years ago, his mother from illness, his father from the same life that was now claiming him in a different way. His only brother Marcus, a corporate lawyer in Manhattan who had once been his closest ally, hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade. A business decision that had gone wrong, a falling out over methods and morality, and the silence that followed had hardened into something neither of them knew how to break. Adrian had everything most men dreamed of possessing, and in this stark hospital room, He realized he had nothing at all. Back at his residence in the Pacific Heights district, the silence felt different than it ever had before. Not peaceful, but oppressive. The house itself was everything Adrian Santoro represented, old-world elegance mixed with understated power. No glass and steel modern architecture here. Instead, thick stone walls, dark mahogany wood throughout, heavy curtains that kept the California sun at bay, and lighting that came from brass fixtures rather than recessed LEDs. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, greeted him at the door with concern etched into her weathered face. She had worked for the Santoro family for 30 years, had known Adrian since he was a boy learning the family business at his father's knee. "Welcome home, Mr. Santoro," she said softly, her voice cautious, knowing something had changed but not daring to ask. He nodded, offering no explanation, no reassurance. Adrian walked past the formal living room with its leather furniture and old family photographs in silver frames, past the dining room with the table that could seat 12 but rarely seated anyone, and into his study. The study was his sanctuary, the only room in the house that truly felt like his. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions and family histories, a massive desk that had belonged to his grandfather, and the faint lingering scent of cigars and aged whiskey. He sat in the leather chair behind the desk and stared at nothing, his mind a careful blank because thinking meant feeling and feeling meant acknowledging what was happening to him. Hours passed. The sunset bled through the heavy curtains, casting the room in shades of amber and shadow. Night fell with its familiar sounds, distant traffic, the occasional siren, the whisper of wind through the old trees that lined the property. Finally, unable to bear the silence in his own thoughts any longer, Adrian stood. His movements were slower than usual, his body already beginning to betray him in small ways. He left the study, his steps uncertain in a way they had never been before, until he found her in the hallway. Amelia. The young woman was arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase, her movements careful and precise, completely absorbed in the simple task. She was 23, small and slight, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in simple clothes that spoke of function over fashion. She had worked in his household for 3 years, since she was barely 20, and in all that time she had been a constant presence, quiet, kind, always there yet never intrusive. Adrian had noticed her the way one notices furniture or wallpaper, as part of the backdrop of daily life. But now, standing in the hallway with death's timeline ticking in his head, he really looked at her. Truly looked. There was something in the way she held herself, a natural grace mixed with careful reserve. Her face, when concentrated, showed a kind of innocence that seemed impossible in his world. Not naivety, she had worked too hard, seen too much to be naive, but a quality of goodness that had somehow survived intact. "Amelia," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. She looked up, startled by his sudden presence. Her eyes widened slightly. "I fishy." Not with fear, but with concern. In 3 years, he had rarely spoken to her directly beyond simple instructions, and never with this intensity. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked gently, setting down the flowers. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, this young woman who had existed on the periphery of his life, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the cancer eating through his pancreas. "You've been working here for 3 years," he said, more statement than question. She nodded slowly, uncertain where this was leading. "Yes, sir, since I was 20. "Tell me about yourself, before this." Amelia blinked, surprised by the personal question. I cleaned offices downtown before this. Took care of my grandmother until she passed. Worked 2 jobs to make ends meet." Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the quiet strength of someone who had learned resilience early and worn it like armor. Adrian nodded, then gestured toward his study. "Come with me. I need to speak with you." She hesitated, confusion crossing her features, but she obeyed. In his world, when Adrian Santoro asked for something, people complied. But there was also something in his tone, something vulnerable beneath the authority, that made her follow without fear. In the study, he gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. She perched on the edge, hands folded in her lap, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to being background, to listening rather than speaking. Adrian sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. He looked at his hands for a moment, at the gold ring bearing his family crest that he'd worn since his father's funeral, then raised his eyes to meet hers. "The doctors gave me 6 months," he said, the words coming out flat and final. "No bargaining, no fixing, just time running out." Amelia's breath caught audibly, her hand instinctively moving to her mouth. Her eyes, wide and dark, filled with instant sympathy. "I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered, the words barely audible but carrying genuine sorrow. Adrian watched her reaction, saw the authentic grief there for a man she barely knew, and something in his chest tightened further. "I don't want to die and be forgotten, Amelia," he said, his voice low and rough. "I want to leave something behind, something alive, something that carries my blood forward when everything else is gone." She tilted her head slightly, not understanding yet, but beginning to sense where this was leading. Her fingers twisted together nervously. "I want a child," he said, and the words landed between them like stones dropping into still water. "My blood, my name. I want you to carry that forward when I'm gone." The silence that followed was absolute. Amelia stared at him, her face cycling through shock, confusion, disbelief. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The clock on the mantel ticked, each second stretching into eternity. "Sir, she finally managed, her voice cracking. I've never been with anyone before." The admission came out in a rush, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment and something deeper. The vulnerability of sharing something so personal with a man who existed in a world completely foreign to her own. Adrian nodded slowly, unsurprised. He had known, somehow, had sensed the innocence in her, the way she carried herself with a kind of untouched quality that was rare in his circles. "I know." More silence stretched between them, heavy and complicated. Amelia's hands trembled visibly now, her breath coming faster. "I always thought," she whispered, her voice breaking, "when I gave myself to someone, it would be for love, that it would mean something beyond just biology." Adrian's expression softened in a way few people ever witnessed. The hard edges that defined him seemed to blur, revealing something human underneath, something capable of understanding exactly what he was asking her to sacrifice. "I don't ask for love," he said quietly, "only trust, and the chance to leave something real behind, something that outlives the mistakes and the empire and the name, just a child, a piece of me that's innocent and new." Amelia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She stepped back, her mind clearly racing, her heart pounding so hard he could see her pulse jumping in her throat. "This isn't something I can decide right now," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I need time. I need to think." "Of course," Adrian replied, not moving from his chair. "Take all the time you need. I'm not trying to force you, Amelia. I'm asking. There's a difference." She turned and left quickly, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, fading as she climbed the stairs to her small room on the third floor. Adrian remained in his chair, alone in the amber light of his study, staring at the door she had disappeared through. His heart, already fragile and failing, felt heavier than it ever had. The house that had once made him feel powerful now felt like a mausoleum, a place where he would die alone unless he could convince one innocent woman to give him the one thing his empire couldn't buy. He closed his eyes and whispered into the silence, a prayer to gods he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. "Please say yes, Amelia. Just this one gift. One piece of me left in this world when everything else turns to ash." Upstairs, in her small room, tucked under the eaves, Amelia sat on the edge of her narrow bed, clutching a pillow to her chest. The walls around her were thin, decorated with nothing more than a crucifix her grandmother had given her, and a small photograph of her family taken years ago, when everyone was still alive and the future held possibilities she had long since abandoned. Tears streamed down her face, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of the decision being placed on her shoulders. She had grown up with nothing, lost everyone who mattered, worked for every dollar, every moment of stability. Nothing had prepared her for this, not the raw desperation in Adrian Santoro's voice, not the grief naked in his eyes, and not the strange, complicated truth rising in her chest. The truth that somewhere in the middle of this impossible request, her heart was breaking for a man she barely knew. Breaking because she understood, perhaps better than he realized, what it meant to face the end alone. And breaking because some part of her, some deep and unexplored part, wanted to say yes. The next morning arrived with fog rolling in from the bay, turning San Francisco into a city of ghosts and shadows. Soft gray light filtered through Amelia's window, barely touching the worn wooden floor where she had paced most of the night. She had not slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed and dry from hours of tears and thought, from prayer and questioning, and the desperate search for an answer that felt right rather than just possible. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded and refolded the same shirt, not because it needed attention, but because she needed something to do, some way to occupy her body while her mind spun in circles. Adrian's words replayed endlessly in her thoughts. The tone of his voice, stripped of its usual authority and left with only raw need. The stillness in his dark eyes, the quiet desperation that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with mortality. This was not a man trying to use her or manipulate her. This was a man drowning, reaching out with his last breath for something to keep him from disappearing completely. But what did that make her? A savior? A sacrifice? A means to an end? And more complicated still, what would it make the child? Downstairs, the house moved with its usual morning rhythm, though Mrs. Chen had given most of the staff the day off at Adrian's request. He wanted silence, wanted space to think, or perhaps to stop thinking altogether. He had not emerged from his study since the previous night, had not eaten or drunk anything beyond the whiskey that sat in a crystal tumbler on his desk, barely touched. Amelia descended the staircase slowly, her heart pounding with each step. She paused outside his study door, her hand hovering above the ornate brass handle, then pulled back. Not yet. She wasn't ready to give her answer because she still didn't fully understand what her answer was. Instead, she walked past the closed door, through the formal rooms that always felt too grand for her presence, and out through the glass doors that led to the small garden tucked behind the estate. It wasn't much, just a few flower beds carefully maintained by a service Adrian barely noticed, a stone bench worn smooth by years of weather, and the shelter of old trees that had witnessed generations of Santoros before him. This had always been her quiet place, the one corner of the property that felt like it belonged to her rather than to the weight of history and power that filled every other space. She sat on the bench and let herself simply breathe, watching morning light break through the muck and pale shafts that made the wet grass glow. From his study window on the second floor, Adrian watched her, his hand pressed lightly against the cold glass, his reflection ghostly in the pane. He didn't call out, didn't send Mrs. Chen to fetch her, didn't try to control this moment the way he had controlled so much of his life. He had made his request, laid himself bare in a way that felt more dangerous than any negotiation he'd ever conducted. Now he had to wait, and waiting had never been his strength. His entire existence had been built on action, on strategy, on seizing control before situations could spiral away from him. But this one thing he wanted more than anything else in his 42 years, was completely beyond his control. The irony wasn't lost on him. He turned away from the window and returned to his desk, sinking into the leather chair that creaked familiarly beneath his weight. The laptop sat unopened, the phone silent, the carefully organized files suddenly meaningless. None of it mattered. The empire, the connections, the respect and fear his name commanded. All of it would vanish with him, leaving nothing but stories that would fade and distort with each retelling. Only a child would carry his blood forward, would carry the possibility of redemption for everything he had done and failed to do. By noon, Amelia returned inside. Her hair was damp from the morning fog, her eyes clearer than they had been, but still carrying the weight of a decision not yet made. She went about her tasks with quiet precision, dusting surfaces that didn't need dusting, wiping counters already clean, avoiding the study where she knew Adrian waited like a man sentenced but not yet executed. She wasn't afraid of him. That had never been the issue. She had seen glimpses of the man beneath the reputation over the 3 years she'd worked here, had watched him read late into the night, choosing philosophy over business journals, had noticed the way he paused at family photographs, his expression softening before hardening again. had heard him once, through the too thin walls, speaking in Italian on the phone to someone he called fratello, brother, his voice raw with regret before the call ended abruptly. No, she wasn't afraid of Adrian Santoro. She was afraid of herself, of what saying yes might mean for her soul, her future, her sense of self. But she was also beginning to understand something that scared her even more. She wanted to say yes, not for money, not out of pity, but because somewhere in the complexity of his request, she recognized something fundamental, the desire to matter, to leave a mark, to transform suffering into something that could grow and breathe and laugh. That evening, after the sun had set and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Amelia stood once again outside Adrian's study. This time she didn't hesitate. She opened the door and stepped inside, her footsteps soft on the Persian rug. Adrian looked up from the chair where he'd spent most of the day, his face drawn and pale but his eyes alert, searching her expression for an answer before she spoke. She didn't sit. She didn't smile. She simply stood in the middle of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, and spoke with a quiet strength that surprised them both. "I will do it," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. "Not for money, not out of pity, but because maybe, just maybe, I understand what it means to leave this world without ever truly having touched something that lasts, without leaving proof that you existed beyond memories that fade." Adrian rose slowly from his chair, his movements careful, as if sudden motion might shatter this fragile moment. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words, a rarity for a man who had built a life on knowing exactly what to say. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying more vulnerability than she had ever heard from him. She nodded, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that matched his own. "I don't know what tomorrow brings. I don't know how I'll feel after, but I know I can't look away from you. Not now. Not when you're asking me to give you the only thing I have that truly matters." There was no ceremony, no grand gesture, just two people standing in a room filled with shadows and the weight of a decision that would change both their lives forever. Adrian stepped closer, slowly giving her time to change her mind, to flee. But she didn't move. Her breath quickened, but she held her ground, her trust a tangible thing between them. He reached out gently, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that seemed impossible from hands that had signed orders and sealed fates. She didn't flinch. Her eyes fluttered closed for just a moment, her breath hitching but steadying. Slowly, with the kind of care usually reserved for sacred things, Adrian leaned in and pressed his forehead to hers. Neither spoke. The silence said what words couldn't, that this wasn't just transaction or desperation, but something that might, if they were careful and brave, become something approaching grace. When he kissed her, it wasn't urgent or demanding. It was reverent, like a prayer whispered in darkness, like a man touching something holy he didn't deserve but desperately needed. Later in his bedroom, a space as austere and controlled as the rest of the house, with its dark wood and heavy curtains and the faint scent of cedar and leather. Amelia stood before the mirror, wrapped in a simple cotton robe Adrian had given her without explanation. Her fingers trembled as she untied the sash, letting it fall to the floor with a whisper of fabric. Adrian watched her with something beyond desire, something that looked like awe, as though he were witnessing a ritual he had no right to be part of, but couldn't turn away from. She climbed onto the bed, her movements uncertain but determined, and lay beside him. Their hands found each other first, fingers interlacing with a gentleness that spoke of connection rather than conquest. He kissed her again, slower this time, tasting salt from tears she didn't realize she was crying. When he whispered her name, it carried more weight than any name he had ever spoken. Not a command, not a dismissal, but an acknowledgement that she was real, that she mattered, that this moment mattered more than anything else in his carefully constructed world. Their bodies moved with care, each touch a question, each breath an answer. There was awkwardness. Yes, the stumbling honesty of inexperience meeting restraint, but also a kind of trust neither had expected. When she gasped or trembled, when the newness of sensation overwhelmed her, he stopped, waited. His eyes searched hers for permission to continue, for assurance that this was still what she wanted. "I've got you," he whispered more than once, his lips brushing her temple, her cheek, her shoulder. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I just want to give you something that outlives us both." She nodded through tears that were equal parts pain and relief in something she couldn't name, letting go of everything she had feared, everything she had doubted, and gave him the only gift she had left to offer, herself wholly and without reservation. Afterwards, they lay tangled in the sheets, the room filled with nothing but the sound of breathing and the low hum of the city outside the windows. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the unsteady rhythm of his heart, a heart that was failing but still fighting, still hoping. He stroked her hair with one hand, the other resting protectively over her fingers where they lay against his ribs. For a long time, neither spoke. Words felt inadequate, too small to contain what had passed between them. "Thank you, Amelia," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely let surface. She didn't reply with words, but her silence was enough, an acceptance, an acknowledgement that they had crossed a threshold together and there was no going back to who they had been before. In the days that followed, something subtle but undeniable shifted between them. She brought him tea in the mornings without being asked, sitting with him in the study, while he pretended to read business reports he no longer cared about. He asked her about her childhood, about her favorite music, her dreams deferred, the grandmother who had raised her with love despite their poverty. They laughed once, truly laughed, when he attempted to cook breakfast and nearly set the kitchen on fire. His competence in every other arena completely absent when faced with a stove and eggs. Mrs. Chen had returned to find them both giggling like children, and the look of shock on her face only made them laugh harder. It wasn't love, not yet. Perhaps it would never be. But it was something tender, something fragile, something real. A connection forged not in romance but in shared vulnerability, in the space between dying and living where both found unexpected comfort. Then came the night he collapsed again. Amelia had been in her room, already changed for sleep, when she heard the heavy thud in the hallway. She ran, her bare feet slapping against hardwood, and found Adrian on the floor unconscious, his face gray in the dim light. Her screams shattered the quiet house. Mrs. Chen appeared, already dialing emergency services. Within minutes, sirens wailed outside, and paramedics were lifting Adrian onto a stretcher, while Amelia clutched his hand, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Don't leave yet. Please don't leave yet." The hospital kept him for 3 days. Complications, the doctor said, expected at this stage. The cancer was accelerating, eating through him faster than their initial projections. He might have 3 months left, maybe less. Amelia didn't leave his side. She held his hand while he slept, whispered stories to him about her grandmother, about the flowers in his garden, about the life she imagined for the child they might have created. She pressed her forehead to his and begged silently for one more day, one more conversation, one more moment of his unexpected kindness. When he finally woke, his first word was her name. "Amelia." "I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." He smiled weakly, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "Good, because I'm not finished yet. Still have things to settle." Back home, recovering but visibly weaker, Adrian called his lawyer, a man named Thomas Brennan, who had served the Santoro family for decades and knew how to document things that existed in legal gray areas. In Amelia's presence, Adrian dictated changes to his will, his voice steady despite his body's weakness. Primary guardian. Heir. The child, unnamed yet but fully acknowledged. Everything protected, everything documented with the kind of precision that would make challenges difficult if not impossible. He gave her an envelope sealed with wax bearing his family crest. "Open this only if something happens to me before we know." She took it with trembling hands but didn't open it. Instead, she tucked it into the drawer beside her bed, a tangible weight of promises and protection. Meanwhile, alone in her room during the quiet hours of early morning, Amelia stared at her calendar, her mind doing calculations she had done a dozen times already. 2 weeks late, nausea that hit like clockwork each dawn, the sudden sensitivity to smells that made walking through the kitchen an ordeal. She ran to the pharmacy in the rain, her coat pulled tight, her heart pounding with hope and terror in equal measure. She bought the test with shaking hands, returned home, locked herself in the bathroom, and waited. Two pink lines appeared with a clarity that stole her breath. A child. His child. Amelia sank to the tile floor, her palm pressing flat against her still flat stomach, tears streaming down her face as the reality settled into her bones. "You're here," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "You're real. You're his. And you're mine." In that moment, she understood with perfect clarity that she hadn't just given something to a dying man. She had received something in return: life, hope, a piece of Adrian Santoro that would outlive the empire, the reputation, the carefully controlled world he had built. She had created the only thing that truly mattered: a future. The sky over San Francisco remained overcast for days, a persistent gray that matched the weight settling over Adrian's household. Amelia moved through the rooms with a secret growing inside her, the pregnancy confirmed but not yet revealed. She wanted to be certain, wanted to wait until the first trimester passed, until the risk of loss diminished. But more than that, she wanted to tell Adrian when he was strong enough to truly hear it, to feel the body rather than just the relief. His condition, however, continued to deteriorate. The collapse had marked a turning point, a shift from managing illness to simply enduring it. He spent more time in bed, more time drifting in and out of sleep, medicated against pain that clawed at him with increasing ferocity. Yet in his lucid moments, he asked for her, always for her. Amelia would sit beside his bed, holding his hand, reading to him from books she found in his study, philosophy and history and poetry that seemed to comfort him in ways business reports never had. Sometimes he would smile at a particular passage. Sometimes he would squeeze her hand as if to say he was still there, still fighting. One afternoon, as weak sunlight finally broke through the clouds and streamed across his bed, Adrian opened his eyes with unusual clarity. His gaze found hers immediately, and he seemed to be studying her face as if memorizing every detail. "You look different," he said, his voice raspy but certain. "There's something. Are you well?" Amelia's heart jumped. She wasn't ready to tell him yet, hadn't planned to reveal it like this, but looking into his eyes, seeing the desperate hope there mixed with fear of the answer, she couldn't lie. "I'm fine," she said softly, then added with the faintest smile, "We're fine." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before comprehension dawned in his expression. His eyes widened, then filled with tears he made no attempt to hide. His free hand moved shakily to cover hers where it rested on his chest. "You're certain?" he whispered. "As certain as the test can make me. It's still early, but yes, you're going to be a father, Adrian." A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob, and he pulled her hand to his lips, pressing kisses to her knuckles, with a fervor that spoke of gratitude too deep for words. Tears streamed down his face, soaking into the pillow beneath his head. "Thank you," he managed, his voice breaking. "Thank you, Amelia. You've given me everything." She leaned down, pressing her forehead to his, her own tears falling to mix with his. "You gave me something too. Purpose, the chance to create something beautiful from all this pain." They stayed like that for a long time, two people bound together by the most fundamental human hope, that life continues, that love, in whatever form it takes, can triumph over death. But the reality of his condition couldn't be ignored. Adrian's lawyer returned with documents that needed signing, witnesses that needed coordinating. Thomas Brennan was efficient and discreet, asking no questions, raising no concerns, simply ensuring that every legal protection was in place. Adrian signed with shaking hands, his signature barely legible but legally binding. Trust funds, guardianship agreements, letters of intent that outlined his wishes with the precision of a man who had spent his life in worlds where words were weapons and contracts were armor. In one particularly lucid evening, he asked Amelia to open the drawer beside his bed. Inside was a small velvet box she hadn't noticed before. "Open it," he said softly. She did, revealing a delicate gold chain with a small pendant, a saint's medal she didn't recognize at first. He saw her confusion and explained with a faint smile. "Saint Gerard, patron saint of motherhood and unborn children. My mother wore this when she carried me. My grandmother before her." He paused, gathering strength. "I want you to have it. For protection. For remembrance." Amelia's fingers trembled as she lifted the chain, feeling the weight of generations it carried. She fastened it around her neck, the metal settling against her skin still warm from the box. I'll treasure it, she promised, and I'll tell our child, where it came from, who you were. Not who I was, Adrian corrected gently. Who I am, present tense. Even after I'm gone, I'll be present in them. In you, in every choice you make to raise them well. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Amelia's morning sickness intensified, sending her to the bathroom at dawn where she retched quietly, trying not to wake Adrian even though he always seemed to know. He would call for her softly and she would return to find him watching with concern and something that looked like wonder. Is it always like this? He asked one morning as she sipped ginger tea he'd had Mrs. Chen prepare. The books say it passes, she replied with a weak smile, usually by the second trimester. Books. He shook his head slightly. I should have known you'd research everything. Someone has to, she said, the gentle teasing between them now as natural as breathing. But beneath the tender moments, a darker current ran. Adrian was fading, the cancer no longer content to wait its projected timeline. His skin took on a grayish pallor, his appetite vanished, and the pain medication increased to levels that left him floating between consciousness and dreams. Dr. Brennan suggested hospice care, nurses who could manage his symptoms with expertise Amelia lacked, but Adrian refused. Here, he said firmly, one of his last clear decisions, I die here, in my home, with her beside me. No hospitals, no strangers. So they brought the equipment to him, the hospital bed, the monitors, the IV stands that turned his bedroom into a medical facility. But Amelia insisted on small touches of humanity, fresh flowers on the nightstand, soft music playing low, the curtains open during the day so he could see the garden and remember there was still a world outside his dying. One night, as fog rolled thick through the streets and turned the house into an island floating in gray, Adrian woke from restless sleep to find Amelia asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his, her face peaceful in a way it rarely was during waking hours. He studied her in the dim light, this young woman who had agreed to carry his legacy forward, who had given him more in a few short months than decades of empire building had provided. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was good, genuinely, fundamentally good in a way his world rarely produced. With his free hand, Adrian reached for the pen and paper on his nightstand, his movements slow and labored but determined. He wrote in the careful script his father had taught him decades ago, each word chosen with the precision of a final testament. When he finished, he folded the paper and tucked it into the drawer, labeled simply with her name. Then he allowed himself to sleep again, his hand still in hers, his breathing shallow but steady. The end, when it came, was quiet. No dramatic final scene, no last profound words, just a gradual slipping away in the hour before dawn when the house was at its most still. Amelia woke to find his hand gone cold in hers, his chest no longer rising, his face finally free of the pain that had haunted him for months. She didn't scream, didn't panic. She simply sat for a long moment, her other hand resting on the small swell of her belly where his child grew, and whispered the words he had once said to her. Thank you, Adrian, for trusting me, for giving me this gift, for letting me be the one who carries you forward. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to cry. Not for herself, but for the man who had died with only one person to mourn him, who had built an empire but found his only true legacy in the simple act of asking for help. Outside, San Francisco began to wake. The fog lifted, revealing a city that continued its relentless motion, unaware that one of its hidden kings had departed. But in that bedroom, in that moment of ending and beginning, Amelia understood something profound. Death and birth were not opposites, but partners in the endless cycle of what it meant to be human. She stood, kissed Adrian's forehead one final time, and went to call Thomas Brennan. There were arrangements to be made, legacies to protect, and a future to fight for. The funeral was everything Adrian would have expected and nothing he would have wanted. Private but heavily guarded, attended by men in expensive suits, whose faces revealed nothing, whose eyes constantly scanned for threats real or imagined. Thomas Brennan had orchestrated everything with the discretion that came from decades serving families like the Santoros, families whose business required shadows and silence. Amelia stood at the back of the small chapel, her black dress simple and modest, her hand resting protectively on the barely visible swell of her stomach. The medal Adrian had given her hung beneath her collar, hidden but present, a secret shared between them even now. Not a single family member spoke to her, not one acknowledgement of her presence or her grief. To them, she remained what she had always been, staff, background, someone whose existence barely registered beyond function. They had no idea what she carried, no concept that the Santoro legacy they thought they controlled was growing inside someone they considered beneath their notice. She watched as they lowered the casket into the ground, watched as expensive flowers were arranged, watched as one by one the attendees dispersed to waiting cars that would take them to meetings about dividing what Adrian had built. None of them lingered. None of them seemed to mourn the man, only the vacuum his death created. When the last car pulled away and the cemetery workers began their task of filling the grave, Amelia finally approached. She knelt on the damp earth, her hand pressed flat against the cold ground, and spoke softly. "I'll keep my promises to you. All of them. Your child will know who you were, not the legend, but the man who asked for help when he needed it most, who chose vulnerability over pride, who wanted so badly to leave something good behind that he trusted a stranger with everything that mattered." She stood, brushing dirt from her dress, and turned to find Thomas Brennan waiting respectfully at a distance. The elderly lawyer approached when she acknowledged him with a nod. "Ms. Morgan," he said formally, then softened slightly. "How are you managing?" "As well as can be expected," she replied, her voice steady despite the grief pressing against her chest. "The house feels empty now, hollow." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm afraid it's about to feel worse. The family's legal team has begun proceedings to contest portions of the will. Nothing related to you or the child yet. They don't know about either. But they're moving quickly to secure assets they feel should have passed to blood relatives." Amelia's jaw tightened. Adrian anticipated this? He did, which is why he was so thorough with his documentation. But these things take time, and time is something we need to be careful with. Thomas handed her an envelope. "This is from Adrian. He left it with me months ago, with instructions that it be delivered only if you were carrying his child." Her hands trembled as she took it, recognizing Adrian's handwriting on the outside. She tucked it into her purse, not trusting herself to open it here in this place of endings. "There's something else," Thomas continued carefully. "Adrian had a former business partner who reached out when he heard of the death. Richard Reed. He was pushed out of their partnership years ago, but apparently they had reconciled privately in recent months. Mr. Reed has expressed interest in speaking with you." "Why?" Amelia asked, suspicious of anyone connected to Adrian's world. "I believe," Thomas said slowly, "because Adrian asked him to watch over you, to ensure that certain protections remained in place regardless of what the family tried to do." That night, alone in the big house that now felt like a museum of memories, Amelia finally opened Adrian's letter. Her hands shook as she unfolded the pages, his familiar handwriting blurring through her tears. "My dearest Amelia, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you carry within you the only piece of me worth saving. I want you to know that the brief time we had together gave me something I had never experienced in 42 years of living. My amazing peace, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something worth protecting. You will face challenges. My family will not accept you easily, if at all. They operate from fear and greed, two emotions that make people cruel. But you are stronger than they know. You have survived poverty, loss, and loneliness. You can survive by their disdain. I have established a trust that should provide for you and our child comfortably. Thomas knows every detail, every protection I could build into the documents. But money alone won't shield you from what's coming. You will need allies. Richard Reed is one. I know you don't know him, but he is perhaps the only man from my world I would trust with you and our child's safety. He is honest in a profession built on deception, and he carries guilt over our falling out that makes him loyal in ways self-interest never could. Raise our child with the goodness I saw in you from the first moment I truly looked. Teach them that strength and kindness are not opposites, that legacy is not about wealth or power, but about the mark we leave on the hearts of others. I have loved only twice in my life. Once in my youth, a love that ended in tragedy and taught me that I could not protect those I cared for from my world's darkness. And once at the end, when you gave me the greatest gift, the chance to believe I could leave something pure behind despite everything I had done. I don't ask you to remember me perfectly. Remember me honestly, the good and the bad, the kindness and the mistakes. Let our child know that their father was complicated, flawed, but trying in the end to be better than he was. Thank you, Amelia, for the nights you sat beside my bed, for the patience you showed when I was difficult, for the grace with which you carried an impossible request. Thank you for saying yes when you could have walked away. Thank you for giving me hope in my final months. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and you will be a remarkable mother to our child. With gratitude and the closest thing to love I had left to give, Adrian Amelia pressed the letter to her chest and wept. For him, for herself, for the child who would never know their father's voice or touch. She wept until there were no tears left, until exhaustion pulled her into dreamless sleep on the couch in his study, surrounded by the scent of cigars and leather that still lingered despite his absence. The next morning brought a knock at the door. Mrs. Chen, eyes red from her own grief, opened it to reveal a tall man with silver-touched hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once without judgment. "I'm Richard Reed," he said quietly. "I believe Miss Morgan is expecting me." Amelia wasn't, but she came to the door anyway, studying this man Adrian had trusted, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motive. She found none, only a deep weariness and something that looked like genuine concern. "May I come in?" Richard asked. "I have things to discuss, about Adrian, about you, and about what happens next." She stepped aside, allowing him entry into the home that was already beginning to feel like it belonged to ghosts and memories rather than the living. They sat in the same study where Adrian had first asked her the impossible question, where everything had begun. And as Richard Reed began to speak, laying out the reality of what she was facing and the help Adrian had arranged, Amelia realized that her journey through grief and uncertainty was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The weeks following Adrian's death moved with the strange dual quality of both crawling slowly and racing past too quickly. Amelia's pregnancy progressed, her body changing in ways that filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. The morning sickness that had plagued her began to ease as she entered the second trimester, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that made even simple tasks feel monumental. Richard Reed became a steady presence in her life, appearing at regular intervals with updates on the legal battles brewing beneath the surface, with groceries he claimed were on his way anyway. With quiet companionship that asked nothing in return. He was 15 years older than Adrian had been, with the kind of weathered elegance that spoke of a life lived fully and not always easily. Their first real conversation happened in the small cafe near the waterfront, away from the house that still felt heavy with Adrian's absence. Richard had requested the meeting, and Amelia had agreed more out of curiosity than trust. "Adrian spoke of you," Richard began, stirring sugar into coffee he didn't seem interested in drinking. "Often, especially in those last months." Amelia wrapped her hands around her tea, the warmth comforting against San Francisco's persistent chill. "He mentioned you as well, said you were the only honest man he knew in a dishonest world." Richard smiled sadly. He was being generous. "I've made my share of mistakes, taken shortcuts I'm not proud of, but I never lied to him." That mattered to Adrian more than most people understood. "Why did you two fall out?" Amelia asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry. That's not my business." "It's fair to ask," Richard replied, finally taking a sip of his cooling coffee. "We disagreed about methods, about how far was too far in protecting what we'd built. I wanted out before we crossed lines I couldn't uncross. Adrian wasn't ready to hear that. We both said things we regretted, and pride kept us from apologizing until it was almost too late." He pulled an envelope from his jacket, setting it on the table between them. "This is from Adrian. He gave it to me 3 months before he died, with specific instructions about timing and circumstances." Amelia's heart tightened. Another letter, another message from beyond. She took it with trembling fingers. Inside was a trust agreement, meticulously detailed, outlining financial support for both her and the child. More than money, though, it established legal protections, guardianship rights, paternity acknowledgement, a framework that would make challenging her position exponentially more difficult. He thought of everything, she whispered, scanning the pages. He tried, Richard agreed. But even Adrian couldn't predict every angle, every challenge. His family is already moving to contest parts of the estate. They're hiring investigators, digging into your background, looking for anything they can use to paint you as opportunistic or fraudulent. Amelia set the papers down, her stomach churning with something that had nothing to do with pregnancy. I never asked him for any of this. He came to me. I know, and that truth will be your strongest defense. Richard leaned forward, his expression intent. But truth alone isn't always enough in these situations. You need more than documentation. You need someone willing to stand in that courtroom and testify to Adrian's state of mind, his intentions, his explicit wishes. You, Amelia realized. Me, Richard confirmed, if you'll accept my help, not because I owe Adrian, though I do, but because I've watched you these past weeks. I've seen how you carry yourself with dignity despite grief, how you protect that child even when no one knows to acknowledge it yet. You deserve better than what they're going to put you through. Something in Amelia's chest loosened slightly. For weeks, she had felt utterly alone, drowning in paperwork and grief and the terrifying responsibility of carrying Adrian's legacy. Having an ally, someone who knew that world and could navigate its treacherous waters, felt like being thrown a lifeline. Okay, she said quietly. Yes, I accept your help. Richard nodded, relief evident in his expression. Then let's prepare for what's coming. Because the Santoro family has already filed their first petition, and we have exactly 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing. The preparation was exhausting. Hours spent with attorneys, reviewing every document, every piece of communication, every witness who could testify to Adrian's intentions. The lawyers Richard had arranged, sharp, experienced women who specialized in estate law and weren't intimidated by old money or veiled threats, walked Amelia through what to expect. They'll attack your character first, one attorney explained, her voice matter-of-fact. Paint you as a gold digger who manipulated a dying man. They'll question the timeline, suggest coercion, maybe even hint at undue influence. But I have proof, Amelia protested. Medical records, Adrian's own written words. Proof matters, the attorney agreed, but so does narrative, and their narrative will be compelling to people who want to believe it. That someone of your background couldn't possibly have legitimate claim to Santoro wealth without manipulation involved. The words stung, but Amelia forced herself to hear them, to prepare for the gauntlet she would have to walk. Richard sat beside her through all of it, occasionally interjecting with details about Adrian's character, his history, his known wishes regarding legacy. As the hearing date approached, Amelia's anxiety grew alongside her belly. She was starting to show now, the small bump unmistakable beneath loose clothing. Part of her wanted to reveal it immediately, to let the world see the physical proof of her claim. But Richard and the attorneys counseled patience. Timing matters, Richard said gently one evening as they reviewed testimony in the study. If we reveal the pregnancy too early, they'll claim you're using it as leverage. If we wait for the right moment, when they've already committed to their narrative, it becomes undeniable truth rather than strategic revelation. Amelia nodded, understanding the logic, even as her heart rebelled against treating her child as a legal strategy. That night, alone in the house that still echoed with memories, she stood in what she had begun thinking of as the nursery, a small room adjacent to Adrian's former bedroom that caught morning light beautifully. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the first flutter of movement that the book said would come soon. Your father was complicated, she whispered to the life inside her. Powerful and flawed and trying so hard to leave something good behind. I'm going to fight for you, for your name, for your right to exist without shame or hiding. But it's going to get ugly before it gets better. The flutter came again, stronger this time, as if in response. Amelia smiled through fresh tears, feeling less alone than she had in weeks. The courthouse loomed against San Francisco's gray sky like a monument to judgment itself. Its stone pillars casting long shadows across marble steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Amelia stood at the entrance, one hand resting on the folder of documents Richard had carefully prepared, the other pressed lightly against the swell of her belly that was now impossible to hide. She had dressed carefully that morning, a navy dress that covered her modestly but didn't conceal her pregnancy, her hair pulled back simply, the saint's medal Adrian had given her visible at her throat. No makeup beyond what made her look healthy rather than exhausted, no jewelry beyond her grandmother's simple cross. She wanted to look like exactly what she was, a young woman telling the truth. Richard stood beside her, solid and calm in a charcoal suit, his presence a silent anchor. "Remember," he said quietly, "you don't have to convince them you're perfect. Just honest." They climbed the steps together, each one feeling heavier than it should. Inside, the air was cold and still, the kind of institutional silence that made even whispers feel like shouts. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate, which somehow made it worse. On the other side sat the Santoro family's representatives, two attorneys in expensive suits with briefcases that probably cost more than Amelia had earned in a year of working for Adrian. Behind them, Adrian's cousin Marco, a man in his 50s with cold eyes and the kind of barely concealed contempt that needed no words. The judge, a woman named Margaret Chen with silver-streaked black hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, called the session to order. Her expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of her thoughts. The Santoro attorneys opened with precision and barely veiled disdain, painting a picture of Amelia as opportunistic, calculating, someone who had taken advantage of a vulnerable dying man. They questioned the timeline of her employment, suggested impropriety in her relationship with Adrian, presented surveillance logs that showed her comings and goings in ways designed to look suspicious. Mr. Morgan was an employee, the lead attorney stated, his voice smooth as silk and just as slippery. A domestic worker with no formal education beyond high school, no family wealth, no prospects beyond whatever employment she could secure. And suddenly, mere months before Mr. Santoro's death, she allegedly enters into an intimate relationship with her employer, a man whose estate is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He paused for effect, looking directly at Amelia with undisguised skepticism. "We would ask this court to consider the improbability of such a relationship being anything other than calculated manipulation of a man facing his mortality." Amelia sat motionless, Richard's earlier coaching echoing in her mind. Let them talk. Let them build their narrative. The truth comes after they've committed to their lies. When it was their turn, Amelia's attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Reeves, who had built a career on defending the underestimated, rose with calm authority. "My client doesn't dispute her employment history," Patricia began, her voice clear and strong. "She was indeed Mr. Santoro's employee. She did indeed come from modest circumstances. And yes, she did enter into a personal relationship with him in his final months. But what the opposing counsel fails to mention is that this relationship was initiated by Mr. Santoro himself, documented extensively, and resulted in the pregnancy Ms. Morgan now carries. A pregnancy DNA testing has already confirmed is Adrian Santoro's biological child." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marco Santoro's expression flickered, surprise, then calculation, then something darker. Patricia continued, laying out the timeline with precision. The medical records from Adrian's oncologist confirming his terminal diagnosis. The personal letters Adrian had written, witnessed, and notarized, explicitly stating his wish to have a child who would carry his legacy forward. The trust documents he had established months before his death, naming Amelia and their unborn child as beneficiaries. "This isn't a story of manipulation," Patricia stated firmly. "It's a story of a dying man seeking redemption, seeking to leave behind something pure and good despite the complicated nature of his life. And it's the story of a young woman who agreed to carry that hope forward, not for financial gain. She never asked for money, but because she understood what it meant to want to matter, to leave a mark, to create life from the shadow of death." Then came Richard's turn to testify. He took the stand with quiet dignity, his eyes meeting Amelia's briefly before focusing on the judge. "I knew Adrian Santoro for 25 years, Richard began. "We built a business together, fell out over principles, and reconciled in his final months. I can state unequivocally that Adrian's decision to ask Ms. Morgan to carry his child was not made in confusion or under duress. It was the most lucid, most intentional decision I witnessed him make in all our years together. The opposing attorney tried to shake Richard's testimony, suggesting financial motivations, questioning his objectivity. But Richard remained steady, unshakable. Adrian didn't want to die and be forgotten, Richard said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. He wanted to leave behind something that could outlive his mistakes, his reputation, his empire. That child, he gestured to Amelia's belly, is his final act of hope. And if this court denies that child their rightful place, it will be because of prejudice about who their mother is, not because of any lack of legitimacy. Finally, it was Amelia's turn. Patricia had prepared her extensively, but nothing could fully prepare her for walking to the witness stand feeling dozens of eyes evaluating, judging, dismissing her before she even spoke. She took the oath with a steady hand, her voice clear despite the fear threading through her chest. Patricia began gently. Ms. Morgan, can you describe your relationship with Adrian Santoro? Amelia took a breath, then spoke with the honesty that was her only real weapon. He was my employer for 3 years. I was his housekeeper. We barely spoke beyond simple work directions. Then he got sick, and everything changed. How so? He came to me one evening and told me he was dying, that he had 6 months, maybe less, and that he wanted to leave behind a child, someone to carry his name and his blood forward when he was gone. He asked if I would consider carrying that child. What was your initial response? I was shocked, terrified. I told him I'd never been with anyone before, that I'd always imagined giving myself to someone I loved. Amelia's voice caught slightly. But he wasn't asking for love. He was asking for trust, for the chance to leave something good behind. Patricia nodded, her expression encouraging. And what made you agree? Amelia looked directly at the judge, her voice steady now, strengthened by truth. Because I understood what it meant to be alone, to work every day wondering if you'd leave any mark at all on this world. I lost my parents young, raised by my grandmother who died when I was 19. I've spent most of my adult life invisible, just another person cleaning other people's homes, living paycheck to paycheck. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When Adrian asked me to give him a child, he was asking me to create something that would outlive both of us, something innocent and new. And I realized that maybe I could give him that gift, and in doing so, give myself purpose I'd never had before. Did Mr. Santoro offer you money for this? Not until later, when he established the trust. And even then it wasn't payment. It was protection. He wanted to make sure his child and I would be safe after he was gone. Amelia's hand moved to her belly unconsciously. He knew his family wouldn't accept us easily. He was trying to build walls around us before he couldn't anymore. The opposing attorney's cross-examination was brutal, as expected. He questioned her motives, her timeline, suggested she had researched Adrian's wealth before agreeing to his proposal. But Amelia remained steady, answering each question with simple truth, refusing to be baited into anger or defensive elaborations. When he finally asked, with poorly concealed contempt, Ms. Morgan, do you honestly expect this court to believe a man like Adrian Santoro would choose someone of your background if he was thinking clearly? Amelia met his gaze without flinching. I expect this court to believe that a dying man wanted to create life, that he saw in me not my bank account nor my education, but the capacity to give him something money couldn't buy, hope. And yes, I believe he chose me exactly because I came from nothing, because I would raise his child with humility and gratitude rather than entitlement. Silence filled the courtroom. Even Marco Santoro looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Judge Chen, who had been taking notes throughout, looked up. Her expression was inscrutable, but there was something in her eyes, perhaps recognition, perhaps respect, that gave Amelia the first real hope she'd felt since entering the courtroom. I'll need time to review all evidence and testimony, the judge stated, but I will say this. I've heard many estate cases in my years on this bench, many claims of manipulation and undue influence. What I've heard today strikes me as remarkably straightforward, a man facing death making provisions for a child he wanted to exist. The circumstances are unusual, yes, but unusual doesn't mean illegitimate. She looked at the Santoro attorneys. If your clients wish to continue challenging this, they may do so. But they should understand that DNA evidence, documented intentions, and multiple witnesses to Mr. Santoro's state of mind create a very high bar to overcome. The preliminary ruling came 2 weeks later. The court recognized Amelia's child as Adrian Santoro's biological and legal heir, entitled to the provisions he had established. The trust was reinstated, the guardianship affirmed, and a stern warning issued against further harassment. Outside the courthouse, as reporters who had caught wind of the unusual case began to swarm, Richard shielded Amelia with practiced efficiency, guiding her to his waiting car. "You did it," he said quietly as they pulled away from the chaos. "You stood up to them and didn't break." Amelia pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the stronger movements now that marked her second trimester. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have survived that alone." Richard glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You're stronger than you know, Amelia. Stronger than you give yourself credit for." As they drove through San Francisco's bummy streets, Amelia allowed herself, for the first time in months, to imagine a future that wasn't defined by courts and challenges. A future where she could simply be a mother, raising Adrian's child in peace. She didn't know yet that Marco Santoro would file a second challenge within months, or that Calvin Rhodes, Adrian's former legal advisor, would emerge with letters that revealed Adrian's complicated past. She didn't know that the path ahead would test her in ways the courtroom hadn't. But for now, in this moment, she had won. And that was enough. The months following the court victory brought a kind of peace Amelia had never known, though it was peace tinged with bittersweetness. Her belly grew round and full, the baby inside her increasingly active, making his presence known with kicks and rolls that made her laugh and cry in equal measure. Richard had helped her move from Adrian's vast house into a smaller, warmer home near the Presidio, a neighborhood with trees and quiet streets, places where children played and families walked dogs at sunset. The house itself was modest by San Francisco standards, but to Amelia it felt like a palace. 2 bedrooms, a small garden, walls that didn't echo with the weight of history and reputation. She painted the nursery herself, soft greens and whites, each brushstroke an act of hope and healing. Richard appeared one Saturday with paint-splattered jeans and a smile that transformed his usually serious face, and together they assembled the crib Adrian's trust had provided for, laughing when Richard couldn't figure out which piece went where despite the clearly labeled instructions. "Adrian would have been terrible at this too," Richard said, stepping back to examine their handiwork. "He could orchestrate million-dollar deals, but couldn't assemble IKEA furniture to save his life." Amelia smiled, one hand on her aching back, the other on her belly. "Did you know him well, before everything fell apart between you?" Richard's expression shifted, nostalgia mixing with regret. "I knew him better than anyone except maybe his mother. We met when we were both trying to make our way in a world that didn't care about where we came from, only about whether we were willing to do what it took to survive." He sat on the edge of the rocking chair they'd placed by the window. Adrian was brilliant, ruthless when necessary, but never cruel for cruelty's sake. He had his own code, his own ethics, even if they didn't always align with conventional morality. What broke us apart was me questioning whether the code was enough, whether survival justified everything we were doing. "Do you regret walking away?" Amelia asked, lowering herself carefully onto the small bench beneath the window. "Sometimes. But mostly I regret that we wasted years in silence that could have been spent finding our way back to each other." Richard looked at her, his gaze direct. "Which is why I'm grateful he asked me to look after you. It gave us both a chance at redemption he never thought he'd have." As spring turned to summer, their connection deepened in quiet ways. Richard came by often, sometimes with groceries and takeout dinners, sometimes with books he thought she might enjoy, sometimes simply to sit on the porch and watch the fog roll in while she sipped decaf tea and he nursed coffee that had long since gone cold. They talked about everything. His daughter from a marriage that had ended years ago, now in college and rarely speaking to him. Her grandmother's cooking and the Italian lullabies the old woman had sung despite their Irish heritage. Learned from a neighbor who had loved them both. Their mutual sense of having lived on the margins of worlds they never quite belonged to. One evening in late July, As the baby's due date approached and Amelia felt too large and uncomfortable to do much beyond exist, Richard arrived with a bag from her favorite bakery. "Cannoli," he announced, setting the bag on the small kitchen table. "Because you mentioned once that your grandmother used to make them, and I thought maybe—" He trailed off, suddenly uncertain in a way she'd never seen from him. Amelia felt tears prick her eyes. Hormones, she told herself. But deeper than that, gratitude for someone who remembered small details, or who showed up not because he had to, but because he wanted to. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice thick. "For everything. For standing with me in that courtroom. For being here. For making this feel less lonely." He stepped closer, his hand almost reaching for hers before stopping. "Amelia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I don't expect anything in return. That I'm not saying this to pressure you or change our friendship or—" "Richard," she interrupted gently, saving him from his own spiral of words. "Just say it." He took a breath. "I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in longer than I can remember. Watching you these past months, your strength and grace, and the way you've refused to let any of this break you, it's reminded me that goodness still exists in the world. And I know the timing is terrible. I know you're still grieving Adrian and about to have his child, and the last thing you need is—" This time she stopped him by placing her hand over his, a gesture small but deliberate. "I know," she said softly. "I've known for a while, and I don't know what that means yet, or what I'm ready for. But I do know that you've become important to me. That when I imagine the future, you're part of it. Maybe not in ways I can define yet, but definitely there." Richard's eyes searched hers, hope and caution warring in his expression. "That's enough," he said finally. "More than enough." They ate cannoli in comfortable silence, and when he left that night, he kissed her forehead. Gentle, reverent, nothing more. But it felt like a beginning. The baby came on a warm August morning, 2 days before his due date. Amelia's water broke while she was watering the garden, and by the time Richard raced over to drive her to the hospital, she was already timing contractions with the focused intensity that would carry her through the next 8 hours. The labor was long and exhausting, but not unbearable. Richard stayed the entire time, holding her hand through contractions, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, telling her terrible jokes that made her laugh even through the pain. When the baby finally arrived, his first cry filling the delivery room with the sound of new life, Amelia wept with relief and joy and grief all tangled together. The nurse placed him on her chest, warm, wet, perfect, and Amelia looked down at the tiny face that held echoes of Adrian she couldn't deny. Dark hair, already thick, serious eyes that seemed to study her even in these first moments. Adrian's nose, Adrian's chin, Adrian's potential written in every feature. "Hello, baby," she whispered, her fingers tracing the curve of his cheek. "I'm your mama. We've been waiting to meet you." Richard stood at a respectful distance, his eyes bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. When the initial rush of activity calmed and Amelia had been cleaned and settled into a recovery room, she called him closer. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. Richard's hands trembled as he carefully took the sleeping infant, cradling him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. He looked down at the baby, then up at Amelia, his expression full of wonder. "What will you name him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia had thought about this for months, weighing options, trying to honor Adrian while giving their son his own identity. "Ethan," she said. "Ethan Adrian Santoro. Ethan means strong, firm. And Adrian, well, his father deserves to be remembered in his name." Richard nodded, his thumb brushing softly over Ethan's tiny hand. "It's perfect. He's perfect." In the days that followed, life reorganized itself around this new, tiny person who demanded everything and gave so much in return. Amelia discovered depths of exhaustion she hadn't known existed, and depths of love that surprised her even more. Every cry, every feeding, every diaper change felt monumental, evidence that she was keeping this miracle alive. Richard proved invaluable, appearing with meals and clean laundry, holding Ethan so Amelia could shower or sleep for precious hours. He never presumed, never overstepped, but his presence became as essential as breathing. One evening, when Ethan was 3 weeks old and finally sleeping for longer stretches, Amelia found Richard sitting in the rocking chair, the baby asleep on his chest, Richard's hand spread protectively across Ethan's small back. She stood in the doorway watching, her heart doing something complicated and beautiful in her chest. This man, who had every reason to walk away after the court case concluded, had instead woven himself into the fabric of their small family. Not replacing Adrian, no one could, but creating something new alongside the memory. "Richard," she said softly, not wanting to wake the baby. He looked up, smiling. "He likes the rocking chair. Falls asleep every time. You're good with him. He makes it easy." Richard's expression grew more serious. "Amelia, I know we've talked about this carefully, about taking things slow, but I need you to know I'm not going anywhere, not unless you tell me to. This," he gestured to encompass the room, the baby, her. "This is where I want to be." Amelia crossed the room and sat on the ottoman beside the rocking chair, her hand resting on Richard's knee. "I don't want you to go anywhere. I think I'm falling in love with you. I didn't think I could, not so soon after Adrian. But you're not replacing him. You're showing me that there's room in a heart for grief and love at the same time." Richard's free hand covered hers, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I loved my daughter's mother once, but it burned out fast and bitter. What I feel for you is different, slower, steadier, like finding home after years of wandering." They sat like that until Ethan stirred, hungry again, and the practical demands of parenthood pulled them back into motion. But something had shifted, settled, become certain. 6 months later, as autumn painted San Francisco in golds and reds, Richard proposed. Not with fanfare or a grand gesture, but on a quiet Sunday morning, while Ethan napped and they sat together in the garden, coffee cooling in their mugs. "I want to be his father," Richard said simply. "Not to replace Adrian, but to be present in all the ways that matter. And I want to be your husband, if you'll have me." The ring was simple, a band of white gold with a small sapphire that matched the saint's medal she still wore. "Yes," Amelia said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." They wed in December, a small ceremony in that same garden where Richard had proposed, Ethan bundled in Richard's arms throughout the vows. No grand cathedral, no hundreds of guests, just close friends, including Thomas Brennan, who stood as witness, his eyes misty behind his glasses. The officiant spoke of love born from kindness, of families built from choice as much as blood, of second chances and the courage to embrace them. When Richard slipped the ring onto Amelia's finger and she did the same for him, little Ethan clapped his chubby hands together, and everyone laughed through their tears. That evening, after guests had departed and Ethan slept soundly in his crib, Amelia stood with Richard on the small balcony off their bedroom, his arms wrapped around her from behind, both of them looking out at the city lights that seemed to stretch forever. "Do you think Adrian would approve?" she asked quietly. Richard was silent for a moment, considering. "I think he'd be grateful. He wanted you protected, wanted his son raised with love. We're giving him that. Not the way he imagined, perhaps, but something good, something lasting." Amelia turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had become her husband, her partner, her anchor. "I think so too. I think somehow, wherever he is, he knows that Ethan is loved, that I'm not alone, that his final wish to leave something good behind came true in ways neither of us expected." She kissed Richard softly, tasting coffee and the sweetness of wedding cake, tasting the future and all its possibilities. Inside in the nursery, bathed in soft nightlight glow, Ethan slept with one small fist curled near his cheek. On the wall above his crib hung a photograph, the only one Amelia had of Adrian, taken months before he got sick, his rare smile caught in a moment of unguarded happiness. Beside it hung a newer photograph, Amelia, Richard, and Ethan, their faces pressed together, captured by Thomas at the wedding. The contrast between past and future, between what was lost and what was found, hung side by side in perfect balance. 2 years later, on a spring morning bright with promise, Amelia sat in that same garden, while Ethan toddled after butterflies with the determined focus only toddlers possess. Richard appeared with a tray of coffee and fresh pastries, settling beside her on the bench that had witnessed so many of their important conversations. "I got a call this morning," he said, his tone careful, "from Marco Santoro." Amelia stiffened instinctively, old wariness rising. What did he want? To apologize, actually, and to ask if he could meet Ethan. Not to challenge anything, Richard added quickly, seeing her alarm. Just to meet his cousin's son. He said Adrian would have wanted the boy to know his family history, even the complicated parts. Amelia watched Ethan, this beautiful child who carried Adrian's features in her heart, who knew nothing yet of courts or challenges, or the complicated legacy of his bloodline. What do you think? She asked Richard. I think, Richard said slowly, that we can control how it happens. Set boundaries. But Ethan deserves to know where he comes from. All of it. The good, the bad, the messy truth. Amelia nodded, knowing he was right. Okay, but on our terms, in our home, and if there's even a hint of judgment or manipulation, we shut it down immediately, Richard finished. Agreed. The meeting when it happened was awkward but not hostile. Marco Santoro, older and somehow diminished without the armor of litigation around him, knelt to Ethan's level and spoke gently. You look like your father did as a boy, he said in his voice thick. Same serious expression, same way of studying everything like you're training to figure it all out. Ethan, with the fearlessness of 2-year-olds, reached out and touched Marco's face. Sad? He asked, his vocabulary limited, but his perception sharp. Marco's composure cracked. Yes, little one. Sad that I didn't know your father better. Sad that I fought against your mother when I should have been grateful she gave him what he needed most. He looked at Amelia then, meeting her eyes with something that might have been respect. I was wrong. About you. About all of this. You gave Adrian hope when he had none, and you gave our family a future we didn't deserve. Thank you. The apology didn't erase the trauma of the court battles or the months of stress, but it created space for something new. Badai, Bamahano. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but acceptance. Ethan would know his extended family, would understand his heritage, but always with the security of parents who loved him unconditionally. As years passed, life settled into the beautiful mundane of raising a child, building a marriage, creating traditions that belonged to them alone. They visited Adrian's grave together each year on Ethan's birthday, letting the boy leave flowers and tell his father about his year. First words, first steps, first day of preschool. Amelia kept her promise to Adrian, teaching Ethan about his father with honesty, but love. About a man who had made mistakes, but tried to be better at the end. About the importance of using power responsibly, of choosing kindness over convenience, of understanding that legacy wasn't about wealth, but about the hearts you touched. And Richard became simply dad, not stepdad or adopted father, just dad. The man who taught Ethan to ride a bike, who read bedtime stories in funny voices, who showed up to every school event and doctor's appointment without fail. On Ethan's 7th birthday, as they stood in that same garden now filled with the chaos of children playing and parents chatting, Amelia felt Richard's arms slip around her waist. Happy? He asked, though he knew the answer. Profoundly, she replied, watching Ethan laugh with the pure joy only children possess. Adrian gave me this gift, this beautiful, perfect boy. But you gave me something too, a family, a home, the chance to build something lasting from what could have been just tragedy. Richard kissed her temple. We gave each other that. You taught me that it's never too late to choose love over bitterness, hope over resignation. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that seemed almost too beautiful to be real, Amelia thought of that night so long ago when a dying man had asked an impossible thing from her. She thought of the fear and courage that decision required, of the storms they had weathered, of the peace they'd found. Love, she had learned, came in many forms. The desperate love of a man facing death, the steady love of a partner choosing to stay, the fierce love of a mother for her child, and the quiet love of building a life together, day by ordinary day, until those days added up to something extraordinary. In the photograph that would be taken that evening, everyone gathered together, Ethan blowing out candles with determined breath. You could see it all. The past acknowledged in features passed down, in the medal Amelia still wore in the name Ethan carried, and the future bright with promise, in the family they'd chosen, in the love that had grown from the most unlikely seeds. Adrian Santoro had wanted to leave something that outlived his empire, his reputation, his mistakes. And he had. Not just in the son who bore his name, but in the capacity for growth and healing he'd sparked in a young woman's heart, in the second chance he'd given an old friend, in the family that had formed around his final act of hope. The legacy he'd sought wasn't found in boardrooms or bank accounts. It was found here, in a garden filled with laughter, in a child loved beyond measure, in two people who had learned that the bravest thing we can do is love again after loss. And as the candles flickered in the gathering dusk, Amelia whispered a prayer of gratitude to Adrian for the gift of Ethan, to Richard for the gift of partnership, and to whatever forces guided lost souls toward each other in the darkness, helping them find their way home. The end was not an ending at all, but a beginning that continued with each sunrise, each milestone, each moment of ordinary grace. And in that continuation, Adrian Santoro's true legacy lived on, not in stone or steel, but in love that multiplied and endured.